The night of October 6, 2018, was unlike any other in the history of mixed martial arts. The air inside the T-Mobile Arena in Las Vegas was thick with tension, an almost tangible energy radiating from the thousands of fans packed into the stands. Some roared with Irish pride, their voices blending into a chorus of cheers, while others stood firm in quiet confidence, draped in the colors of Dagestan. This wasn't just a fight, it was a collision of worlds, a battle fueled by months of personal attacks, bitter rivalries, and an unstoppable force meeting an immovable object. Conor McGregor, the brash, outspoken striker with a nation behind him, stepped into the cage to face Khabib Nurmagomedov, the undefeated Dagestani wrestler, a man who fought not for fame but for legacy. The world watched, holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen when these two titans finally clashed. Long before the first punch was thrown, the war had already begun. Conor, a master of psychological warfare, had spent months chipping away at Khabib's resolve, testing his patience with every press conference, interview, and social media post. He mocked his heritage, ridiculed his fighting style, and insulted his family. For most fighters, these words would have been just noise, distractions meant to throw them off their game. But Khabib was different. He absorbed every word, let every insult burn into his mind, storing it away like fuel for the moment he would finally get his hands on the Irishman inside the cage. The more Conor talked, the quieter Khabib became, a silent storm brewing just beneath the surface. And when the fight was finally set, there was no escaping the inevitable. The octagon doors locked behind them, and in that moment, all the noise faded into a deafening silence. Conor, ever confident, circled, light on his feet, searching for an opening. Khabib, composed and calculating, stood firm, waiting for his moment. The fight began, and within seconds, the game plan was clear. Conor needed space. Khabib needed control. The first takedown attempt came quickly, and Conor, despite his impeccable timing and striking accuracy, found himself fighting against an unrelenting force. Khabib's grip was like iron, his pressure suffocating, his every move designed to drain the energy from his opponent. As the rounds went on, the intensity only grew. Conor fought with everything he had, landing clean shots when he could, using every ounce of his skill to keep the fight standing. But Khabib was relentless, dragging him down, wearing him out, making him feel every second of the grueling battle. And then, in the fourth round, it happened. A single moment that would forever be etched into MMA history. Khabib locked in a choke, his arms tightening around Conor's neck, and within seconds, the Irishman had no choice but to tap. The fight was over. The rivalry had reached its climax. Or so it seemed. What happened next shocked the world. Instead of celebrating, instead of basking in his victory, Khabib climbed over the cage, leaping into the crowd, his sights set on Conor's team. Chaos erupted. Security swarmed the octagon, trying to contain the mayhem, but the fire had already been lit. It was no longer just about two fighters. It had become something bigger, something personal, something that wouldn't be settled with a single fight. In the aftermath, questions remained. Would there be a rematch? Would the rivalry ever truly be over? Or had this fight merely been the beginning of something even greater, a war that would continue to echo through the sport for years to come? As the dust settled from the chaotic aftermath, the world was left to digest the events that had unfolded. What was supposed to be a pinnacle of sportsmanship and athleticism had instead spiraled into a spectacle of violence and unpredictability. Fans and pundits alike tried to make sense of the fight's aftermath, but the true story was far from over. This was a rivalry that extended beyond the octagon. It was personal, it was cultural, and it was deeply rooted in the men's contrasting worldviews. Conor McGregor, a man who built his career on swagger, confidence, and charm, had met his match in a man whose strength lay not in his words, but in his silence. Conor's rise to fame was legendary. From humble beginnings in Dublin, Ireland, he had fought his way to the top, winning over fans and earning millions with his larger-than-life persona. He was the king of the spotlight, the one who loved to talk, trash talk, and entertain. But behind the bravado was a fighter who had made a career out of defying the odds, a man who could back up every boast with raw talent and an uncanny ability to perform under pressure. His story had become a blueprint for success in the world of combat sports. Yet, when he stepped into the cage with Khabib, that blueprint was tested in ways he had never imagined. Khabib Nurmagomedov, on the other hand, came from a world where words held little weight. In the rugged hills of Dagestan, he was raised in the harshest of environments, where survival meant strength, discipline, and respect. His father, a former wrestler and martial arts coach, had instilled in him an unshakable resolve. Khabib didn't need to talk, his actions spoke for him. And his undefeated record, 28 wins, no losses, was a testament to the fact that when he entered the octagon, nothing could stop him. His style was methodical, relentless, and unforgiving. He was a warrior in every sense of the word. But Khabib's strength wasn't just physical, it was mental. He could block out the world, the distractions, the pressure, and focus only on one thing, victory. But when Conor launched his personal attacks, it was clear that Khabib's calm demeanor would be tested in ways it had never been before. Conor's words cut deep, attacking Khabib's family, his faith, and his heritage. And while many expected Khabib to retaliate verbally, he remained steadfast in his silence, letting the insults roll off him like water off a duck's back. Yet, every comment, every jab, added more fuel to his fire. Khabib wasn't just fighting for himself. He was fighting for his people, his culture, his father's teachings. The stakes had risen far beyond the title. From the outside, the fight seemed like the perfect clash of styles. The unpredictable, high-flying striking of Conor McGregor versus the suffocating pressure-heavy grappling of Khabib Nurmagomedov. But those who followed the fighters closely knew that this was more than just a contest of physical skill. It was a battle of egos, of pride, of everything that had been building for years. Conor wasn't just trying to defeat Khabib. He was trying to break him, to show the world that even the most disciplined and unshakable could be humbled. And Khabib? He wasn't just fighting for the win. He was fighting to protect everything that mattered to him, to show that words meant nothing when compared to honor. But there was more at play than just these two men. The fighters weren't the only ones carrying the weight of the rivalry. Conor's camp, full of loyal followers and brash personalities, had a stake in this fight too. They saw their leader as an icon, a champion of the people. When Conor took to the stage, they followed. His success was their success, his trash talk, their anthem. They didn't just cheer for Conor, they believed in him. They stood by his side, a tribe of loyalists who lived and breathed the same mentality. On the other side, Khabib's corner was far more reserved. His family, his father, and his longtime coach were his backbone. They had never sought the limelight, preferring the quiet strength of their culture. They didn't need the applause or the fame, they needed the victory. For Khabib, it wasn't just about the title. It was about proving something deeper, something personal. But beyond the two fighters, there was another layer of intrigue. After the fight, the narrative quickly shifted from the rivalry between McGregor and Khabib to a deeper question: what would happen next? The controversy of the post-fight brawl had cast a shadow over Khabib's victory, and many wondered whether he would face consequences, not just from the UFC but from his own people. Khabib's father, the stern patriarch, had always warned him that there was no room for distractions in a fight. But now, Khabib's actions in the cage threatened to fracture the very foundation of everything he had worked for. Meanwhile, Conor, ever the showman, refused to let the defeat define him. He had been knocked down before, but this loss was different. It wasn't just the physical defeat that stung. It was the way his persona had been shattered, his aura of invincibility broken. For the first time in years, Conor McGregor was vulnerable, exposed, and the world was watching. Would he come back stronger, or would this be the beginning of the end? The question lingered in the air, unanswered, just as the whispers of a potential rematch grew louder. The world had watched the clash, and now the world waited for the next chapter. Would Khabib continue his reign, or would Conor rise from the ashes to reclaim his throne? The tension was palpable, and with every passing day, the anticipation only grew. No one knew where the story would lead next, but one thing was certain: the rivalry was far from over. Months passed after the chaos of that night in Las Vegas, but the fire between Conor and Khabib continued to burn. The story of their rivalry was far from finished. It was merely evolving. Conor's silence after the loss spoke volumes. His social media presence all but disappeared. But beneath the surface, something stirred. Conor knew this defeat wasn't just another setback. It was a personal challenge, an obstacle he couldn't simply forget. The public saw a humbled man, but those closest to him saw the spark of determination reigniting. Conor wasn't finished yet. He couldn't be. The world had watched him fall, and now they would watch him rise. But how? In the quiet months that followed, Conor's camp remained tight-lipped, but rumors began to surface. There were whispers of a rematch, of negotiations taking place behind closed doors. Some believed that the UFC would capitalize on the rivalry, pushing for a showdown that would generate millions in pay-per-view buys. But Khabib, ever the enigma, remained as calm and focused as ever. He had made it clear that his victory over Conor had been a statement, one that needed no follow-up. Yet, as the pressure mounted from the outside world, the cracks began to appear in Khabib's carefully constructed world. It wasn't the loss he feared. It was the burden of living up to his own reputation. And then, without warning, the unexpected twist came. Khabib, in a shocking move, announced his retirement from mixed martial arts. The announcement sent shockwaves through the fight world. The undefeated champion, the man who had become a symbol of discipline, honor, and strength, was stepping away from the sport. Fans were stunned, and media outlets scrambled to understand why. Many speculated that it was due to the tension surrounding the aftermath of the McGregor fight, the controversy over the brawl, and the mounting pressure from fans, media, and even his own people. Others believed it was his father's influence, the man who had been Khabib's guiding force throughout his career, and who had always warned him that one day, the sport would no longer have anything to offer. But the truth was far more complicated. As Khabib withdrew from the spotlight, Conor took advantage of the lull. He doubled down on his training, focusing on his striking game and refining his skills. The longer Khabib stayed away, the more Conor's thirst for a rematch grew. It wasn't just about redemption anymore. It was about proving that he could defeat Khabib, that he could finally break the undefeated streak that had haunted him since their first fight. But while Conor steeled himself for the next battle, he wasn't the only one in this fight. There were other forces at play, moving behind the scenes. In the shadows, Khabib's family and management were facing their own internal struggles. His father, the rock of Khabib's career, was growing older, and with age came a shift in priorities. There were whispers of Khabib stepping into a new role, a role not as a fighter, but as a leader in his community. Some believed that his retirement was just a temporary pause, a way for him to take a step back and reassess his future. Others feared that his decision was final, that Khabib's journey in the UFC had truly come to an end. But then, the final blow was dealt, a bombshell announcement that rocked the MMA world once again. Khabib was coming back, but not for Conor. Not for any fight, really. Khabib announced that he would fight the winner of a highly anticipated title bout between two rising stars. Two men who had been steadily making their mark in the UFC, each in their own unique way. The announcement sent shockwaves through the fan base. For Conor, it was like a slap in the face. Khabib wasn't coming back for him. He wasn't going to give the fans what they wanted. Instead, he was moving on, continuing his legacy without the need for another showdown with McGregor. This unexpected twist left Conor in a dangerous position. His resolve was now being tested in a way that had never happened before. The world had watched Khabib walk away, and now they were witnessing his return, not to face Conor, but to prove that his legacy was bigger than any one fight. The UFC, caught in the middle, was left scrambling. Stage was set for a showdown, but it wasn't the one that everyone had been waiting for. And in the midst of it all, a new rivalry was born, one that would challenge both Khabib and Conor in ways they had never anticipated. The question was no longer just whether Conor could beat Khabib, it was whether he could beat the system that was beginning to shift under his feet. As the tension between the fighters, the UFC, and the fans continued to rise, the stakes grew higher with every passing day. Would Conor finally get his chance at redemption, or would he be left in the dust, watching as Khabib's legacy grew even more unassailable? The fight was no longer just about two men. It was about something much larger, a battle for control, for legacy, and for the future of mixed martial arts. The world was holding its breath. Conor McGregor, the brash, confident, and determined former champion, had been waiting for this moment. Khabib's return had set the stage, but it wasn't for the fight that everyone expected. Conor had been pushed to the brink. His pride, his legacy, everything he had built was on the line. But it wasn't Khabib who would be his greatest challenge this time. It was the very system that had allowed Khabib's rise to dominance. Conor's path forward was no longer about redemption against a single man. It was about proving that he could still control his own destiny in a sport that was rapidly evolving. The UFC, now in a battle to maintain its position as the top promotion in the world, had been navigating the shifting tides of public opinion. Fans were torn, some holding out hope for a Conor-Khabib rematch, others eager for fresh blood and new stories. But the UFC couldn't ignore the undeniable. Khabib's return had revitalized the sport. His undefeated record, his quiet strength, and his unwillingness to engage in the circus of promotion made him an enigmatic figure. And yet, despite all of this, the UFC's decision to line up Khabib against the rising stars seemed to push Conor further into the shadows. He wasn't just fighting for the belt anymore. He was fighting for relevance, for his place in history. As the night of Khabib's return to the octagon approached, Conor found himself training harder than ever. His camp had become more intense, focused on each detail, each technique. He wasn't just learning to fight again, he was learning to fight for himself. The world had counted him out, dismissed him as a man past his prime, but that only fueled the fire burning within him. He had learned over the years that the world would never give him anything. He had to take it. And this time, he wasn't going to let anything stand in his way. When the bell finally rang for Khabib's return fight, the atmosphere was electric, charged with anticipation. Fans packed the arena, knowing that this wasn't just another championship fight. This was a fight for legacy. Khabib's opponent was a rising star, a formidable challenge in his own right. But it wasn't just about who would win, it was about what Khabib's victory would mean for the future of the sport. The stakes had never been higher. The fight began with the familiar rhythm of Khabib's style, dominant, calculated, and suffocating. He pressed his opponent, neutralizing every attempt to break free, controlling the pace of the fight with ease. But there was something different about this night. Something that no one could have predicted. As the rounds wore on, Khabib's opponent, despite being outclassed in nearly every area, began to rally. The momentum shifted slowly but surely, and the crowd began to sense that something was off. Khabib, the master of control, was struggling in ways he hadn't before. His movements were less fluid, his strikes less precise. The energy of the crowd, the weight of the legacy, it all seemed to be pressing down on him. And just when it seemed like Khabib was nearing another dominant victory, the unexpected happened. Khabib's opponent, in a burst of energy and perhaps desperation, landed a devastating shot, a perfect punch, right to Khabib's jaw. The undefeated champion stumbled. The crowd gasped. Khabib, always the picture of calm, was now on shaky ground. For the first time in his career, the world saw a man who wasn't invincible, a champion who could be beaten. Khabib's eyes were wide with shock, but there was no time to dwell. The fight raged on, both fighters now desperately fighting for control, for their place in history. As the final round approached, Khabib found himself facing a new type of challenge, one that he couldn't simply wrestle or outlast. His opponent had become a symbol of the changing tides in the sport, a new generation of fighters who weren't intimidated by the legends. With the seconds ticking down, Khabib's endurance was tested like never before. But then, in a moment of incredible clarity, Khabib locked in a submission, a maneuver he had perfected countless times before. It was flawless, and just like that, the fight was over. His opponent tapped out, and Khabib's hand was raised in victory. The crowd erupted, but this victory felt different. It wasn't the same triumphant moment from his earlier fights. There was a sense of finality in Khabib's eyes, as if he had just realized that the fight was no longer about the belt or the record, it was about knowing when to walk away. And when he finally stood in the center of the octagon, microphone in hand, Khabib's words sent shockwaves through the world. "This is it. I'm done. I've given everything to this sport. But now, it's time for the next generation." It wasn't a retirement announcement. It was a declaration of his place in history, a recognition that the future was no longer about him. As Khabib left the octagon for the final time, the world stood still. For Conor McGregor, this was the moment he had been waiting for. Khabib's exit from the spotlight created a void, one that Conor could fill if he could rise to the occasion. The UFC, seeing the inevitability of a final showdown, began pushing for a rematch. But Conor had learned something over the past years. It wasn't about fighting to prove himself to anyone. It was about fighting for the legacy he wanted to create. As the rematch between Conor and Khabib was finally booked, the stakes had never been higher. The narrative had shifted, the world had changed, and in that moment, it wasn't just about who would win, it was about how the fight would define the future of MMA. What would happen when the two greatest forces in the sport clashed again? Would Khabib retire on top, leaving the game to a new generation? Or would Conor rise again, proving that even in the face of defeat, there's always room for a comeback? The story wasn't over. It was just beginning. And as the crowd roared, the fighters prepared for what would be the most anticipated fight of the century.